perhaps the best thing to do is not think of them as generating brand loyalty, which is a very hard to achieve task and I think questionable. I think what Google have done so well is create a habit. And people unthinkingly now turn to Google rather than choose from all the other different options. And once you start thinking about how do you create a habit, well then there's a huge amount of research into an effective way to do that. It takes about 66 days to form a habit. Even that number is quite useful when you are thinking about, well, what is the phasing of the communications I should do? So, long story short, I wouldn't think of it as a loyalty issue, I'd think of it as a habit one.
Hi, I'm Nick Haig, and welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Richard Shotton to the podcast to talk about his latest book, Hacking the Human Mind. Richard is a renowned behaviour expert and a leading voice in understanding the psychological aspects of consumer behaviour. With years of experience in marketing and behavioural science, he brings a unique perspective to the strategies businesses can employ to connect more effectively with their customers. In today's episode, we'll delve into the insights from Richard's book, exploring how the world's best brands like Amazon, Guinness, and Red Bull all use elements of behavioural science to guide marketing strategies and thus influence consumer decision-making that ultimately leads to profitable business outcomes. Whether you're a seasoned marketer, a business leader, or just simply curious about the psychology behind consumer choices, you won't want to miss this enlightening conversation. And, as always, if you like what you hear, then do please subscribe. We recently achieved a milestone of 100,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel, but there's always room for more, and it really does make a massive difference to the show, so please do subscribe. Welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast, Richard.
Oh, it's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, and it's great to see you again. The last time we spoke was on my previous podcast. You just published The Choice Factory. And in fact, I think it was The Illusion of Choice, which a fantastic book about behavioral psychology, of course, and the principles that can be applied to marketing and business strategy. But you've got a new book out. It's called Hacking the Human Mind. How does that build on your previous two books?
So it's a bit of a spin on the other two, a bit of a build. So the first two books followed familiar pattern. Each chapter was about a particular idea from psychology, a bias, like social proof or the Pratfall effect, and followed the same flow each chapter, broad overview of what the bias was, the existing experimentation that was out there, academic research, then studies I'd done to show these ideas applied commercially and today. And then the most important bit of each chapter was, now you know about these ideas as a marketer, as a business owner, what do you do differently? So that was the first two books. This third book, Hacking the Human Mind, which is co-authored, by the way, with Michael Aaron Flicker, it flips it on its head. So each chapter is about a brand. So there's a chapter on Haagen-Dazs, there's a chapter on Amazon Prime, there's a chapter on Starbucks. And then once we've done a little potted history of the brand, only a short one, we then talk about what are the one or two, maybe three behavioural science principles that have partly powered the success of that brand. And the reason I think that is helpful is it roots these academic ideas, these abstract ideas, these insights into something very tangible. And it's much easier as a reader to understand the idea if we're talking about a very familiar thing like the pumpkin spice latte or Amazon Prime's membership model. So it roots it in, I think, practicality.
Yeah. I completely agree. I mean, I think it's a fantastic book because it's structured around the brand itself. It helps the reader connect the dots between the marketing success of that brand and the science, behavioural science behind it.
Good to hear.
Yeah. So, and at the end of each chapter as well is the three key practical takeaways, which again really it condenses all those thoughts and that great thinking and makes it very adaptable to take away and use. So no,
that's good to hear, because there's no point in just obsessing about the academic minutiae. All the books I've written are really meant to be practical handbooks that, it's a complete waste if people just read them and, it's vaguely interesting. They're really there that people can either apply to their own lives or their professional lives.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's you examine 17 of the world's best brands in your book, analyze what tactics they've used from behavioral science, and I sent you a few thoughts before we started recording. I'd love to go through each one, but we definitely won't have time. So I'll cherry pick a few, and we'll see where we get to on time. But you start the book by introducing the reader to how five guys became successful through what's called the gold dilution effect. Can you tell our listeners more about this principle and how it helped them create the global brand we know today?
Yeah, this one's very much about Five Guys at their inception. And Five Guys is a brand, been around for about 40 years, 30 years, set up by Jerry Murrell and his four sons, hence the Five Guys. And they were inspired to set up this brand on a trip to Ocean City in Maryland. So they're walking along the boardwalk, and there's loads of burger joints, chicken joints, but there is one shop called Thrasher's Fries where there's this massive queue outside. And Murrell goes and investigates, sees what they're up to. And the unique thing about this shop stands out from all the competition is they just do one thing. They just do fries and they just do one condiment. And Murrell thinks, why is it that this brand is doing particularly well? And he puts it down to this focus. So his idea is when Five Guys first launched, they stand out from McDonald's and other burger joints by just focusing on burger and chips. There's no McChicken sandwich, there's no filet of fish, there's no deviation from a very, very tight menu. And that works, I think, for two reasons. There's firstly, the very practical reason that if you just do one thing, you become an expert at it and you become better. So I think there's a practical underlying strength. But what I'm really interested in is the psychology of it. And not only does the actual product get better, but people's perception of it increases at an even higher rate. So there's an argument that people assume that if you do one thing, you will be better than if you try and do multiple things. And that rule of thumb that people have takes on a life of its own. Yeah. So there's a lovely experiment from Zhang and Fishback at the University of Chicago. So it's a 2007 study. And they tell people about 3 or 4 different situations. So one of them is the benefits of eating tomatoes. And these participants read a little bit of text. And the first group hear that tomatoes are really good for warding off cancer. And then the participants are asked to rate how good they think tomatoes are at warding off cancer. The second group read exactly the same bit of text, exactly the same wording, exactly the same sentences. But at the end, there is another short paragraph that says tomatoes are really good at preventing a degenerative eye disease. When that second group is asked to rate how good are tomatoes at warding off cancer, they come back with a statistically significant answer. They are about 12 or 13% less likely to rate tomatoes as being successful at warding off cancer. So exactly the same information is essentially undermined if people are given an additional reason to believe. It seems as if you give people additional reasons to believe, and those extra bits of information are averaging in terms of their impact rather than additive. Yeah. So what I mean by that is if you have one really strong argument, adding on slightly suboptimal arguments tends to dilute it, tends to weaken people's belief. So the point here is that because it's a reasonable assumption in life that those who specialize become better, people take that rule of thumb and then they apply it even when it isn't relevant. So even in this situation, when you're giving exactly the same information, by putting on additional superfluous points, it tends to undermine the impact. So that was one kind of short chapter about this interplay between a successful brand and a particular bias they'd used.
Yeah. And when I read it, it resonated with me. I'm not sure whether it's gold dilution effect or not, but as you know, I ran a market research agency for 25 years called B2B International. So as the name suggests, it was business to business focused. And we did do some consumer research, but well, it was fairly easy to do. Sometimes it was a B2B to C element to the research. But when you've been trying to speak to C-suite members of decision makers of corporate companies, then speaking to consumers was quite easy. So we felt like we were missing out on a bigger part of the market research pie. So we set up a consumer-focused market research company called Deep Sea, SEE, Deep Sea.
Oh yeah, I like you done.
And
Yeah.
we were successful in that we grew it to over 1 million in revenue. We had clients like Mars. But the problem was every time we met a new client, they asked for the background to the company, and we'd go through the whole process of explaining our B2B roots, and that we were utilizing our staff across both agencies. So after it was a year, maybe 2 years, we decided to kill the brand and focus just on one thing, B2B International, and we never looked back on that. And so I don't know whether that's a gold dilution effect or not, but
it would be the gold dilution effect if, when customers hear about the fact you have these two offerings, if it undermined that belief in your B2B chops, your B2B abilities. And the evidence from Zhang and Fishback would suggest, even if objectively the quality wasn't affected, what would happen is that people's expectation would be damaged. And it's not that you couldn't launch a second brand. I mean, as you said, you got up to £1 million of revenue. It's just that it has a negative impact on the two, and therefore you have to have counterbalancing measures to overcome that. So
right.
with these biases, it's not that they are, I think, fatal to be ignored, but they just make your life harder. It's always, in my argument, more effective to work with human nature rather than against it. And what you really want to be doing with these various different principles is making sure you're aligning with as many as possible to give yourself the best chance of success.
Well, as you put in the book, and Daniel Kahneman once said, thinking is to humans as swimming is to cats. They can do it, but they prefer not to. And I really smiled at that. And so it's about coercing people into thinking in that particular way.
Yeah, and I love that quote. It's one of my favourite quotes. I think sometimes people think, Daniel Kahneman was being a bit snobby about people. He thinks people are thick or something, but it's not that. He worked for many years at Princeton. He dealt with some of the most intelligent people in the world. He's super aware that humans are capable of amazing flights of logic. But what he's also very well aware of is that from an evolutionary perspective, energy is a really scarce resource. And thinking is energy intensive and effortful. So as a species, we have evolved to ration that deep considered thought. And most decisions, like which burger joint to go to, most decisions are made in a quick, snap, reflexive way. And the way that we make those super quick decisions is to use what psychologists call like rules of thumb or heuristics. And what's interesting for us as marketers is those rules of thumb are prone to biases. And if you know about a bias, like the gold dilution effect, when you're designing a bit of communications, when you're creating a new brand, essentially, you work with human nature. You work with the grain of how people actually behave. And that's always more effective.
Well, let's move on to another brand, and there are lots of food and drink examples in the book. So I'm going to focus on a few of those to start with. And so the Snickers story is a fascinating one. Can you tell the listeners about how they use trigger moments and humour to become the number one chocolate bar in America?
Yeah. So there's two things Snickers do. Firstly, there is this repeated humorous approach in their marketing. They're genuinely funny. And then the second thing they do is they attach consumption of their products to a very clear moment. Now, both of those, I think, work very well from a behavioural science perspective. The first thing with humour is it's something that you can demonstrate in an ad rather than just claim. And demonstrations are always more powerful than claims. Imagine I said to you, I am a world-class pole vaulter. I can leap over a 6-meter barrier. Now, you may believe me, but you may not. Whereas if there's another chap standing next to us, and he says, "I'm a world-class pole vaulter, watch me," and then proceed to jump over a 6-meter barrier, well, you would give that more credibility. The point is, it's easy. Anyone can claim they can do something amazing, but only someone who has the genuine skills actually does it. So a viewer will always give greater credibility to a demonstration than a vague claim, because it essentially acts as a screening mechanism. Only genuine people can do it. Now, that's what is so powerful about humour. In an advert, you can be funny, whereas most other things, like being trustworthy or tasty or high quality, you can only claim. Now, the obvious response to that is, well, people don't buy chocolate bars because you're funny. They buy a chocolate bar because they want something that's tasty. But actually, that's too literal-minded. What we tend to see from experiments is that if you demonstrate one particular value brilliantly, that affects all your other attributes. So what I mean by that, this is an idea called the halo effect. The original research goes back to the 1930s. And it's essentially the idea that when we are evaluating another person or another product, we are lazy as people. We grab onto one standout feature of a person, and then we use that as a guide to judging all their other characteristics. So if a brand is very, very funny, we will rate that brand as being more humorous. But what's interesting is our ratings for things like trustworthiness, value for money, tastiness, they will all go up as well. We use this one metric as a guide to all the others. It's essentially a time-saving approach. Don't weigh up people on all their metrics independently. Just grab onto one thing and use that elsewhere. So the brilliant thing with humor is if you can actually create funny ads, you will not only be seen as more humorous, all these other kind of more necessary brand values will increase. Now, that might sound like a statement of the obvious. And if we were recording this podcast in 1972, I don't think it would even need mentioning. But what's interesting is the world of business, I think, has become more professionalized. It's become more data-driven. It's become more logical. So what we've seen, there's some lovely work by a research agency called Kantar, was back in the year 2004, 54% of ads tried to amuse. By 2020, it was down to 34%. So we've seen this long-term movement away from what I would argue is one of the best ways to get people to engage with advertising and then change all sorts of feelings about the brand. So for me, I think the underlying brilliance of Snickers is their consistently amusing advertising that they've doubled down on for 20 odd years.
Yeah, and well, I definitely see it with my son's personality. That dramatically changes, and he does get hungry when he needs to be eaten. And I grew up in the 80s, so I remember it as being as marathon, and then it changed globally to Snickers. But I think it is crazy when you think about it. And like you just said, Richard, it sounds so obvious, but when I think back to adverts that really stick in my mind, it's adverts like Carling Black Label, Castlemaine Forex, Tango, Hamlet Cigars, and these ones that really did feed on humour. This is as I was growing up, but 20 years, 30 years later, I can still remember them.
Yeah, and the clues in the name. We work in advertising, and the Latin kind of roots of that, the etymology of it means turn towards. And what people do is they turn towards things that amuse them and put them in a positive frame of mind. They turn away from things that upset them or make them feel a bit crap about themselves. So a little bit of humour, I think, is a very good way to at least get attention. Yeah. Now, the brilliant thing with Snickers is they combine this attention with a very clear trigger moment. So they don't talk about the amazing taste of their chocolate bar in their ads. They talk about this idea of you're not you when you're hungry. So they associate consumption of the Snickers bar with a very clear time and place and mood. And again, that is supported in an awful lot of behavioural science experiments. There's an argument from psychologists, people like Sarah Milne at the University of Bath, and she says there is often an intention to action gap. So often people can intend to exercise or intend to quit smoking, but they never quite get around to doing it. Her argument is motivation or appeal is a necessary but not sufficient condition for behaviour change.
Yeah.
What you need to do is combine appeal with a clear trigger moment. So the point of you're not you when you're hungry is when you have that feeling of hangriness, when you have that feeling of confusion that comes from hunger, that vague interest in Snickers, this kind of vague nebulous knowledge that it's quite tasty, that solidifies into actual behavior change. The creating this trigger moment converts vague desire into action. It essentially acts as a catalyst. So I think it's the combination of these two things that Snickers do so well. And just as with humor, it's not necessarily a complex recommendation for a brand, but because people think they have this, they're laboring under this misassumption. Many marketers think the way to change behavior is to create appeal and motivation because they downplay the need for a trigger. They don't bother doing it. They do all the hard work of creating desire and they miss out that simple association with a very clear point of consumption.
Yeah. I was listening to a podcast the other day, actually. It was James Clear who wrote Atomic Habits,
yeah.
and he was saying, about habits, about how to make you go to the gym regularly and things like that. And I don't know whether it was his words or someone else had said it, but he said the heaviest weight at the gym is the actual front door, the opening of the front door, because it's that habit of making sure you get through it in order to get to the gym. Once you're on your way, you'll go there and you'll do your workout, but it's making sure that you trigger and do that.
Yes. So if it was exercise, what the principle from behavioral science would say is don't say to yourself, okay, I'm going to run regularly. Don't say I'm going to run twice a week. You're more likely to do it if you say, okay, Monday at lunchtime when I turn off my computer, then I'm going for a run. You create these very clear trigger moments. It doesn't have to be complex. Like, if you want to get someone to take vitamins, let's say you want vitamin D, big problem, I think, across especially older people in the UK, often very low vitamin levels. Don't say take a vitamin tablet once a day. Say when you've had your breakfast, take your vitamin D tablet. There's no pharmacological reason that that's better, but once someone starts eating their breakfast, essentially it reminds them of this intention. Unless you have that trigger, the danger is the desire is never converted into action.
Yeah. What's interesting is loads of examples in the book and around junk food and sugary snacks, as we've just been describing. And you'd think in this day and age that brands would be looking to be as healthy and natural as possible, but it doesn't always pay to be healthy, or at least don't tell the consumer about it, as is the case with the Kraft mac and cheese story.
Yes. So Kraft mac and cheese, I didn't quite realise as a Brit, but is an absolutely giant brand in North America. And I think it, like Heinz baked beans in the UK, it really does have this kind of nostalgic reminder of childhood tea time. So it's a huge, huge seller. The issue they had a few years ago was the original recipe, or the recipe they were using at the time, had a lot of artificial preservative, a lot of artificial colours. So they decided that they're going to replace these chemical nasties with natural alternatives. But they realised that they have a problem, which is even though they'd got a formulation that this new natural one was just as good as the artificial one, people couldn't tell the difference. They knew that if they told people they were going to improve the healthiness of the product, it would create negative perceptions, and then that would lead to negative experiences. So the working question about this problem comes from a psychologist called Raghunathan. So back in 2006, he does a study at the McCombs School of Business, recruits a group of Americans, and he serves them a buffet of Indian food. So food they're not particularly familiar with. And they get to try some pakoras, some samosas, curries, naans, but crucially, also a mango lassi. The participants, that is, they rate the quality of every different bit of food. Raghunathan doesn't care about most of the ratings. They're just there as a smokescreen. The only thing that he cares about is what people say about the mango lassi. So if listeners have never heard of a mango lassi, it's a yogurt-based drink. It's quite common in Indian cuisine. Now, the twist in the experiment is sometimes Raghunathan tells people this is a Indian health drink. Other people, he says, this is an unhealthy Indian drink. And what he finds is you get this wildly different set of responses between the two groups. The people that think it's unhealthy, they rate the drink 55% better than the people who think it's healthy. So there's 55% change in ratings. Remember, everyone gets exactly the same drink. The only thing that changes is the story, the label. Raghunathan's argument, and this is true in so many different ways, he says taste isn't just about the physical properties of the food. It's about what we expect. And if we expect a great experience, that becomes self-fulfilling. We go and interpret later kind of taste information in a more positive way. And his argument is, unfortunately, in American culture, and I think arguably British as well, we have grown up to think healthy equals bad tasting. And once we've got that belief in our mind, it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. We try a food and then we go out and look for evidence that backs up our initial hypothesis. So the argument here is, if, like Kraft, you are going to change your formulation and make it more healthy, you've got to think about how you avoid this issue. Now, what Kraft did so brilliantly is what they called the world's biggest blind taste test. So they changed the formulation. They don't tell anyone. So obviously, you have a legal obligation to put the ingredients on the side of the pack in that little white box, but no one reads that. So they changed that, but they didn't have a big starburst on the front saying, now with healthy colorings, now with turmeric rather than E1063. 3 months, they keep silent, and then they do a series of very witty ads saying to people what they'd done. They changed the formulation, and no one had noticed. So what they've done here is get people to try the new product without any of these negative associations with healthiness. Once people have tried the product, then they can reveal later on that actually, they did love it and there was no deterioration. And that avoided this problem of the assumption that healthy equals poor tasting.
Yeah. My eldest is in the States, so I didn't quite know. But I was going down the aisle of one of the supermarkets, and I saw this row after row of these Kraft mac and cheese cartons. What I also found fascinating in the story is that there's another bias called the Pareidolia. I might have said that wrong, where they create this face within the packaging, and I see it all the time. In a plug socket or on a building in a passing cloud, where if you see a face, but I didn't realize there was this bias that people are drawn to faces. So they've, put that within the packaging, and it really did make a difference too.
And it's a broad idea that humans see patterns often where none exist. And one of the most powerful is we will often see a random collection of cloud shapes or dots and dashes. We will interpret it as a face. As you say, you look at a plug and you often see a face there.
Yeah.
And there's a strong evolutionary argument for this. A face, either a human or an animal, was both a massive opportunity. Maybe it was a mating opportunity. Maybe it was a trading opportunity, or a potential threat. It could be a predator or a dangerous kind of tribe who live nearby. So we have evolved to see faces, even if not there. It's better to make the odd mistake and spot a face when there isn't one than make the mistake in the other direction and miss a face of a real person when they are there.
Yeah.
So this is known as pareidolia. And there's some lovely experiments by people like Guido at the University of Salento that shows if an ad has a face-like image, then we're much more likely to spot it than a very similar ad without those face-like images. So now if you think about the Kraft mac and cheese packaging, what they do is they have a little upturned macaroni pasta shape. So it looks like a little smile. So it looks like a face on the packaging. And if you imagine someone's walking down a busy supermarket aisle, they're inundated with different stimuli, most things get ignored. But in that cluttered, busy environment, this use of a tiny little technique like Pareidolia means Kraft mac and cheese have got a better chance of being noticed. And if they're noticed, then there's a chance to, hook people and remind them of their wonderful taste, and then get them purchasing.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, that's what advertising is all about. Getting noticed.
Right. So it's a threshold you've got to get over. There's a wonderful creative director from the 60s, Bill Bernbach, who said, if you're not noticed, everything else is academic. So it's the most basic requirement for advertising. Get that attention, and then you can land those other messages that you need.
Yeah. So we talked about beef burgers, chocolate, mac and cheese. Let's wash it down with a nice pint of my favourite, the black stuff Guinness. What behavioural science secret do they use in order to build their brand?
So the element that we looked at for Guinness was one particular campaign. And it was this amazing campaign done by AMV and Walter Campbell there, where they said, good things come to those who wait. So the great thing about this campaign is it draws attention to what could be seen as a flaw in the Guinness experience. Certainly back in the kind of 1980s and 1990s, there was an awful lot of moaning amongst Guinness drinkers in that they had to wait for their pint while the rest of the rounds who were drinking lager, they'd get their drink immediately. But from a psychological perspective, if a brand leans into that, if they emphasize that flaw of slowness, there are an awful lot of benefits. So the bias that's most relevant to this is one called the Pratfall effect. The original work was done back in 1966 by Elliot Aronson at Harvard. And for his study, he gets a colleague to take part in a quiz. He gives that colleague all the answers to the competition. So the guy does amazingly well, gets 92% of the questions right, looks like a genius, wins the quiz by miles. But then as the quiz is coming to a close, the contestant makes what an American in the 60s would call a pratfall, what you and I would just call a blunder. He spills a cup of coffee down himself. Aronson takes this recording and then he plays it to listeners. But he plays some people the entire incident, great performance and spillage. Some people hear an edited version. They just hear the great quiz performance. And what Aronson then does is ask everyone to rate the appeal of the contestant. And the key finding is that those who heard the spillage as well as the great performance, they rate the contestant 45% more appealing than the people that just heard the amazing display of knowledge. So Aronson calls this the pratfall effect. And essentially, it's the argument that if a person or a product admits to a flaw, they become more appealing. Now, that I think is at the heart of that campaign's success. That rather than try and ignore the fact that there's a delay to your product, you lean into it. You put it right at the front and center of your advertising. It makes the brand feel more human, warmer, more appealing. But then on top of that, what distinguishes Guinness so well is they don't just pick any old flaw. They pick the flaw of slowness. And the brilliant thing with slowness is that it has a mirror strength. Like many weaknesses have mirror strengths. We assume that if something is slow, it's going to be higher quality. So the great thing with Guinness is not just that they apply this bias of the pratfall effect in its broadest sense. It's the art with which they apply it. It's the specific way that they do it. And that, I think, distinguishes it from many, many other campaigns.
Yeah. Yeah, and the campaign, I think, because they've used it on many different adverts, haven't they? I don't know whether it was originally from the surfer advert where he was waiting to catch the perfect wave or whatever. And but you say in the book, it's from that campaign, it achieved 12% increase in Guinness sales. And I don't know, I love Guinness, and I don't know where it's come from actually. But do you drink Guinness, Richard?
I do, more the non-alcoholic stuff. So I love stout, but I tend to go for other stouts unless it's the non-alcoholic, and then I think Guinness is head and shoulders above everything else.
Well, the non-alcoholic stuff tastes exactly the
Yeah,
same,
it's
doesn't it? It
amazing.
really
Yeah.
does. But I don't know where the splitting the G comes from. Where you split the G on the logo. But their sales must be going through the roof, because half your pints, or a
Yeah.
third of your pints, gone before you've even sat down.
I think now they are the largest beer brand in the UK, which is quite a big achievement. And you think of a lot of those brands from the 90s, 2000s that seem to dominate, like Carlsberg and Heineken and Carling, have really have suffered.
Yeah, yeah. So sticking with drinks, a previous guest on the podcast was Rory Sutherland,
Oh
who
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah,
know you
brilliant.
know,
Yeah,
and I watched a fascinating talk of his. He's quite old, I think, but it was how he was talking about Red Bull and how it went against all the conventions to take on Coca-Cola, and of which you write about in the book as well. So could you talk to the listeners about how Red Bull used price relativity in specifically
yes.
to win in the fizzy drink market?
So Rory's talked about this in a brilliant book called Alchemy, and we kind of use this as a starting point in the Red Bull chapter. And it's essentially the argument that when people are thinking about what is a fair price to pay, they don't think about that question in an absolute sense. So what I mean by that is the first time someone has a Red Bull, they don't think to themselves, okay, well, this is going to give me 10 units of happiness. I'm prepared to pay £1 per unit of happiness, whether that's for a mobile phone or a pair of jeans or a soft drink. People don't have this universal yardstick by which they judge willingness to pay, because it's a ludicrously complex question. And going back to that Kahneman quote, thinking as to humans as swimming as to cats, they can do it, but they'd prefer not to. People trade these deep, complex questions for simpler ones that give them an almost as good answer. And when it comes to a simple question in terms of value, what people tend to do is very quickly, when they see a new product, is they think of a comparison set. And then they think to themselves, is this new product more expensive? If so, it's bad value. If it's less expensive, it's good value. Now, that idea that we look at value relatively, not absolutely, that should interest every marketer, because what it means is if you can change your mental comparison set, you can change people's willingness to pay by huge degrees. Now, that all might sound a little bit abstract and speculative, but I've done a few experiments in this area. So with various things like tea brands and beer brands, I've tested this idea of price relativity. But for the book, we did a experiment together just for the book into ice cream. Right. So Michael and I showed a group of people a tub of Ben and Jerry's, $3.99, next to a $1.99 tub of Walmart, same size. And we asked people, how good is the Ben and Jerry's? And 27% of people thought it was good or great value. So remember that number, 27%. Then get rid of that group of people, get a completely fresh group of people, that's key. We show them the Ben and Jerry's ice cream, still for $3.99, still the same size package. But this time, sitting next to it is a very fancy brand called Halo Top, which is $4.99. Now, again, people are asked, how good value is the Ben and Jerry's? Now, this time you see a different answer. You see 41% of people saying it's good or great value. Right. So 27% in that first group, 41% in the second group. Now, that is a 51% improvement. The key thing again here is nothing has changed about the Ben & Jerry's. It's the same brand, it's the same price, it's the same volume. But depending on what comparison was made salient, people's reaction to it changes quite radically. Now, that was applied by Red Bull. Think back to when Red Bull launched. What the other drinks in the market were. What would be the natural comparison? Well, it'd probably be a can of Coke or a can of Pepsi. All those other brands, they sold in quite squat, dumpy 330ml cans. So what Red Bull did brilliantly was sell in a different volume, 250 mils, and a very different shape. It was that very kind of cylindrical, thin shape.
Yeah.
And the point of doing that is it breaks the comparison with Pepsi and Coke. Because back when Red Bull launched, I can't remember the exact numbers now, but let's say Coke was about 30 pence, Red Bull was about £1. If they'd been sold in the same size can, people would have compared the two things and thought, well, this Red Bull stuff gives me loads of energy and it's got loads of caffeine, so I might pay a bit more. I might pay 35 pence or 40 pence, but there's no way in hell I'm paying £1. It would have always been brought back to this comparison, this pretty awful comparison for them of a 30p can of Coca-Cola. But if you change the look of a product, well, then you free it from this this kind of deadweight comparison. That, I think, may be the single best thing that Red Bull did at launch. Change the design, change the comparison set, and then you let it become free floating, as it were.
Yeah. I didn't realise actually that it originated from Thailand. It was used to give Thai workers energy on their grueling shifts, wasn't it? But I think even though
a very different brand, it was, I think, very much for kind of a working class functional brand, famous that like truck drivers who were pulling all night stints would just drink this a bottle of stuff. And it was only the kind of happenstance that an Austrian business guy happens to go to Thailand, see this product, I think there could be a completely different market in Western Europe.
He really did have the foresight for that one, didn't he? But as a researcher, I think, as taking it to a focus group, for example, if you tested it on consumers and said this is a smaller can, we're going to charge 3 times as much for a liquid that doesn't really taste that great, it would have killed the idea straight away. So I think it shows, sometimes you got to go with your instinct. Observation sometimes better than asking, because people really can't express themselves in words, can they? And see how they behave in a real life situation, a test situation.
If you put someone on the spot, you send them a survey, you get them in a focus group, what they tend to do is answer in a manner that they think is the sensible way of deciding. Yeah. So they won't answer and draw reference to these quick rules of thumb that they actually use in the supermarket to pick. They will talk as if whenever faced with an option, they spend an awful lot of time thinking about it, and they laboriously and in a considered manner come to a very sensible, logical decision. So psychologists say, look, it's not that people are necessarily lying. That might be an issue. But there's this idea called confabulating. So if someone confabulates, they're trying to tell the truth, but because they don't know their own motivations, they end up sending you in the kind of wrong direction.
Yeah.
So the problem is with these focus groups or surveys is you get lots of data, but it's the wrong mental model of human behavior, and it can often send you off in the wrong direction. What you want to do instead is not necessarily rely on instinct. I think that can be dangerous, but set up simple test and control experiments. If you believe in this idea of price relativity, you could do a very simple experiment. When you're launching the product, you get people in, you give them 10 squat 330ml cans, and you could make a prototype in which you give them Red Bull in the same shape can. And you could ask people how much they think each product's worth. Then you could do a separate experiment where you get a new group of people, and then you just serve them the Red Bull on its own in that tall cylindrical can. And you could ask them how much they think it's worth. And if you did that at launch, before people have become familiar with it, I think you would have very clearly shown that it's this mental comparison set that changes willingness to pay.
Yeah. So Red Bull used price relativity, whilst Amazon Prime, they use charm pricing and the perception of increased value to drive this repeated engagement. What's charm pricing? How did they build this into the strategy?
So charm pricing is one of the oldest pricing ideas that's around. So back from probably, I think it's the 1870s, 1880s, retailers have used charm pricing. So charm price is a price that ends in 9. So 99 pence is a charm price, £19 is a charm price. A round price would be £20 or £1. Those would be kind of round prices. And what has been shown over about 130 years is consistently and repeatedly, people treat charm prices very differently from another price, which is 1 cent higher. So the main argument for this is what's called the left-hand digit bias. So imagine you're in a supermarket and you see a series of items for, 99 pence or £1.99. What tends to happen is people remember that £1.99 item as one something. You then keep on going and you see something for £2 and you remember that as two something. So it's a way of making life a bit simpler. We don't remember the entire price. We just kind of convert it into something similar. The point being that when you cross these thresholds of going from 99p to £1 or 1.99 to £2, it's not as if you've increased the price by 1%. It's as if you've almost doubled it. So you see these kind of cliff edges in demand. Now, that idea has been shown in experimental conditions many a time. But the nicest example of it is actually from Uber. So Uber have a behavioral science team, quite a big behavioral science team. And a while ago, it was led by a very prestigious economist called Keith Chen. And he did a number of studies with surge pricing. And what he showed was you absolutely see this effect with surge pricing. So they randomized tens of thousands of people into different groups. Some would be shown a surge price for 2x, some for 1.9x. And what they found was that the bump in willingness to take that ride was not just 5%, which I think is the difference in the two numbers. It was much, much steeper because, this kind of cliff edge finding.
Right.
Now, the nice thing about that is it's almost the perfect experiment. People were spending real money. It was on a massive scale, and they didn't know they were taking part in a study, so they couldn't change their responses.
Yeah.
So it's a very kind of robust bit of data. And it also, as an experiment, it had all sorts of other nice little nuances. So, for example, Chen found that some people who were shown a 2.1x surge price, whilst they weren't as likely to take the ride as the 1.9 people, the 2.1 people were still more likely to take the ride than someone who saw a 2x surge price.
Right.
And his argument was, well, consumers assume a rounded price has been marked up to a larger degree than a precise one. You see 2.1x and you think there's still margin that Uber are applying, but you think they've just kind of eked it up to a small degree. If you see a 2x or a 5x, you think they have marked it up, but to a much, much larger amount.
Yeah.
So the point with that is if you go back through the whole history of Amazon Prime, and I wouldn't say this was the determinant of their success, but I think it's a really simple thing that's just eked out a bit more advantage. It's always been a charm price. It's been 79 or 89 or £99. They've always used a charm price. And that's interesting. When it's a company like Amazon who tests things to destruction, when you see them using a very old, very well-known bias that almost gets ignored because it's so well-known, then I think it's really onto something.
Yeah. What I love about Jeff Bezos and the Amazon story is I always at fault in this. I always ask my guests, on the podcast, what's going to change? What's your belief for the future? But he once said that the most important question is not to say what's going to change, but what's not going to change, because then you can build your business strategy around that with confidence. And I think you talk around that in the book as well. So
yeah, I love that Bezos quote. There's another one by Bill Bernbach, the creative director we talked about a bit earlier, and he famously said, it's taken millions of years for human nature to develop. It will take millions of years for it to change. It may be fashionable as communicators to talk about the changing man, but we as communicators, we should be interested in the unchanging man. And I think what behavioral science does is identify those unchanging drivers of human behavior. The needs to copy what others are doing, the prioritization of what's easy over what's right. These things were true 100,000 years ago. They're true today. They'll be true in 100,000 years. So they are super powerful things for people to learn about because there's no expiry date. And it's not like learning about the latest bit of MarTech or the latest AI protocol. These things will be out of date in 6 months. Behavioral science is about the kind of software that humans operate on, and that isn't changing anytime soon.
Yeah. To finish off, Richard, I have my usual questions. I ask all my guests. My last guest was Guy Kawasaki, Chief Evangelist of Apple, or previous Chief Evangelist of Apple, and he's currently Chief Evangelist of Canva, Executive Fellow of Haas Business School, Berkeley. And Guy asked, how can LLM foster brand loyalty when switching costs are negligible?
Oh, fantastic. I think often with these questions, it's worth looking at who has faced a similar problem in the past. And I think you could look to search engines, as being quite a nice proxy. There is a very low switching cost between Bing and Google, yet 90% of the world use Google every day.
Yeah.
And then you can start thinking about, well, how have they generated that? And perhaps the best thing to do is not think of them as generating brand loyalty, which is a very hard to achieve task and I think questionable. I think what Google have done so well is create a habit. People unthinkingly now turn to Google rather than choose from all the other different options. And once you start thinking about how do you create a habit, well, then there's a huge amount of research into an effective way to doing that. There's research into moments when people are open to changing their behavior. When their age ends in 9, just after they've undergone a fresh start, like moving house or having a birthday. There's research about the need to make things easy, especially at the start of a habit. It's disproportionately important to make something as easy as possible. You then have to give people a reward when they undertake the behavior you want. And I would argue maybe the one thing that Google did was harness the gold dilution effect. When they first started out, lots of those other competitors, Lycos, Yahoo, they were trying to be all things to all people. They had these cluttered screens that were telling you they could do a million things. Relentlessly focused just on search for Google. That was I think the part of their appeal. And then the final bit, there's even research into how long it takes to create a habit. There's some wonderful work by Philippa Lally at UCL, who's shown, and James Clear talks about this in Atomic Habits, that it takes about 66 days to form a habit. Now, of course, you dig into a paper and there's all sorts of caveats and nuances because a habit is a very broad thing. But even that number is quite useful when you are thinking about, well, what is the phasing of the communications I should do? So long story short, I wouldn't think of it as a loyalty issue. I'd think of it as a habit one. And then once you think of habit, behavioral science will help you identify the moment to intervene in other people's journeys, the need for removing friction, giving people that benefit, the need for a trigger, and then that kind of magic number of 66 days.
Yeah, great advice. A couple of questions from listeners. So we're going to go all around the world on this one. So first is from Ollie Shawyer in Australia, and he asks, your new book focuses on 17 successful brands. What would change if you studied 17 failures instead? Would the same behavioural patterns show up, suggesting survivorship bias?
So that is a great question.
Yeah.
And it was very much at the front, one of the reasons for writing it the way that we did. So what we didn't do was just take 17 brands and then say, these are super successful brands. Here are some things they did. Then expect people to copy them and have similar success. Because you look at any brand like a Liquid Death or an Amazon Prime, these are big, complex organizations. They do thousands of different things, many of them concurrently. So we know that the brand is improving, but just by looking at what they've done, you don't know whether those individual tactics and strategies and actions contributed to that success or just happened to be there at the same time. So the idea with the business to avoid this problem of survivorship bias is for each brand, we looked at all the things they did. And then we overlaid this lens of behavioral science. We said, of those things, which are the ones that have been shown to work in controlled conditions? So, Five Guys, it wasn't, well, the goal dilution. It wasn't just talking about focus and simplicity because that was something they did. It was also something that Zhang and Fishback had shown does work in these controlled conditions. So I think that's how we've managed to avoid the problem of identifying things that successful brands happen to do rather than things that successful brands did which contribute to their success.
Yeah. Right, next is Lisa Brick. She's in the US and she asks, behavioral science gives us helpful patterns, but real people are messy and context driven. How do you work with that tension? How do you keep the ideas powerful without losing the nuance of how humans actually make decisions?
So it's a really nice question. And I think leaning into the fact that behavioral science is about patterns and propensities It's not guaranteed success. People aren't particles. They don't follow some law that if you intervene in one way, everyone changes their behavior. That would be all very easy and nice for a marketer, but it would be, undeniably a simplification. So I think the best way is to think, if you draw on some of these biases, you increase the probability of your success. You're working with the flow of human nature. But whilst that is an amazingly valuable thing, this increased, likelihood to change on a big group of people could mean millions of extra in revenue for a large brand. But whilst you've got that probability in mind, knowing that it's not definitive and certain and everyone being influenced, I think that what that does is open up a space for creativity. So it leads people to recognize that the best use of these principles is not just unthinkingly taking the behavioral science experiment and force feeding on the comms. The best use of these principles is to see them as a hypothesis about human nature, which then still has to be harnessed, then still has to be exploited. And the best way to do that is through a dash of creativity. Yeah. So if all that sounds worryingly vague, I'll give you an example. One of the best known principles in behavioral science is social proof. It's the argument that if you make a behavior or if you make a product look like it's popular, it will become more appealing and more people will buy it. Now, the pedestrian, boring, literal way of applying that is just to go out and say on the bottom of your website, we have 10,000 customers. Yes, that might have some effects, but it's hardly the most powerful use of behavioral science. What you really want to do is bring to bear the creativity that marketers have. So there's a lovely example. I think it's a 1984, maybe 1985 ad from Ford. And it applies this principle far more wittily. So back in mid-80s, Ford Escort was the world's best-selling car. Now, what most brands would have done is just say, world's best-selling car. But what Ford did is on these giant poster sites, they printed out every single make and model of competitor car, tiny, tiny font. And then over the top, they said, if your car's on this list, Ford Escort outsells it. Now, that is exactly the same principle of social proof as being used by a website that just says we have 10,000 customers. But by applying it with this dash of wit, this bit of flair, they make that bias even more powerful. So I wouldn't disagree with Lisa at all. I'd say, yes, these principles give you a head start on your competitors, but they only take you some of that way. You need to bring to bear your creativity to get the most out of them.
Yeah. You run your own agency as well, Richard. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever been given?
Oh, great question. I think to worry less about what might happen. I think when I first set up my business, I was risk averse, and I kind of slowed down the pace of doing things because I feared like embarrassment or things going wrong. But actually, what you tend to realize is there's a degree of certainty about any intervention with people. I think there is an awful lot to be said for putting your neck on the line, trying something, keep on experimenting, because even though that will expose you to potential ridicule, it will expose you to failure, the odds are always stacked in your favor. What I mean by that is if you do something and it doesn't work, well, you don't do it again. You turn off your losses very quickly. If you do something and it proves to be successful, then you just run it forever. And once you start thinking of the downsides being limited and the upside being limitless, I think it creates this spirit of experimentation and willingness to try new things. Yeah. And I think for me, that came from the writing of Dave Trott. I'm not sure there was one particular article where he says it like that, but I think that's a theme of many of his pieces. So I found the writing of Dave Trott very, very useful.
Yeah. Who would you like to hear on the podcast? Who would you like me to reach out and invite on?
Well, I have noticed you haven't. So if there are two people that I think have been super influential in my career, you've had one of them, which is Rory Sutherland. Yeah, absolute brilliant behavioural scientist. I mean, the other would be Dave Trott. I would get him on. I think he's one of the smartest, most original thinkers, and maybe best of all for a podcast. He tells you what he actually thinks rather than filtering what is the thing that people want to hear. So I think he makes for a very good guest.
Well, do you know what? I've spoken to him about coming on. Rory put him forward. Another guest
Did
put him
he?
forward. Yeah, and so I've been speaking to Dave, and he says podcasts aren't for him.
Oh,
he did
okay.
say if I change my mind, yours
Yeah.
would be one of the ones I'd come on to. So, but this might be another nudge that I should reach out to him, Richard, and ask
I
him.
have heard him on, I think, Radio 4, so maybe you could reframe this as just kind of recorded clips of radio. Yeah, permanently accessible radio. Yeah.
No, and listeners reach out and ask for their guests as well, and Dave's name is always up there. So I it reminds me I need to persist at that and give it another go. Finally, my next guest is Damien Hughes. He co-hosts the High Performance podcast with Jake Humphrey and is the author of 9 books. His latest book is called Micro Habits: Tiny Changes That Supercharge High Performance, co-authored with Jake as well. So what question would you like to ask Damien?
So I haven't read that book, but I've read one of his older ones. I think I love this idea of micro habits, like small changes that can have a big effect. But what I've noticed is I think people are often resistant to that. People think that to have a big change, you have to have a big intervention. So I would really want to ask him, why is it that people are seduced by this idea that they need to make radical change to have a big impact? Why is it people are resistant to believing small change can have a big impact?
Yeah, great question. Well, we haven't touched on so much, KFC, Starbucks, Dyson, Apple, you name it. But so
Dyson, my favourite chapter. Yeah, but we haven't even got to that one. Yeah.
So listeners, you'll have to go out there and buy the book, and it is fabulous. So thanks for joining me today, Richard. This idea that success isn't about outsmarting our customers, but about fundamentally understanding them, their biases, their context, their social drivers. It's real powerful shift that can really help your brand, and reading this book, it really does help to see how some of the best brands out there have used behavioral science. As always, you've got your own podcast, you've got your own website. What's best? Where should people reach out if they want to get in touch?
So probably LinkedIn's the best way to contact me if people are on that. If they're not on that, if they go to astro10.co.uk, there's a little form they can send me a question. And I'd always love to hear about people who are applying behavioural science, or if people need training or help with consultancy, always there to help.
Well, I know you're big on social media, whether it's Twitter, X, LinkedIn. Do follow Richard, listeners, because there's some fascinating insights that he pulls out, and I every day I think you must be posting some snippets of how to use that in everyday life. So do follow that, because it really is enlightening. And we're speaking from our homes, but next time I'm in London, Richard, I'll reach out and we'll get one of those non-alcoholic Guinnesses. And,
yeah. Fantastic.
Thanks a lot for your time, Richard.
Cheers.
Richard holds so much knowledge. I always love it when I speak to him. As just mentioned, we didn't get to touch on a number of other brands I would have liked to talk to him about. So you definitely should go out and buy his book, because it is fascinating. From my notes, looking back on those, I think my 3 key takeaways from the discussion with Richard are probably, well, number one, I think behavioral science can teach us so much, especially with regards to pricing and how people perceive and respond to pricing strategies. We talked about psychological pricing, or charm pricing for Amazon, whereby pricing something at $9.99 instead of $10 can create this perception of a bargain due to how we as humans process numbers. We also talked about price relativity with Red Bull, but there's so many other pricing strategies through behavioral science, including anchoring, scarcity, and social proof. And they're all talked about in Richard's other books. So again, look those up too. Secondly, Richard talked about trigger moments when he was talking about Snickers, and looking through the lens of behavioral science, you should think about a contextual relevance to make your message resonate more. Like Snickers used hunger, brands like Kit Kat have used break time as the trigger, have a break, have a Kit Kat. And there's lots more triggers like emotional triggers, social triggers, and just nudging. After all, why do we think all the chocolate is placed next to the checkout desk when at a supermarket? And finally, my third point, I'd probably say understand your position in the market. Use a perceived weakness as a position of strength like Guinness did. Good things come to those who wait. Reframes the weakness as a strength, emphasizing the longer brewing time as a commitment to quality and richness, whilst also building anticipation, but also lending itself to a great storytelling too. Next up is Damien Hughes talking about micro habits, tiny changes that supercharge high performance. So stay tuned for that one on the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast. Until next time.